Now, on Friday, Theresa May made her first visit to Scotland as Prime Minister and seemed to suggest that Article 50 would only be triggered with the agreement of the whole of the UK. Since then, there's been much speculation as to what exactly that meant. Could it only go ahead with Scotland's backing? Such a move would put Nicola Sturgeon at the heart of any EU negotiations, but it would be at odds with what the new Brexit Minister, David Davis, has been saying. He's made it clear that he wants to see Article 50 enacted by the start of 2017. Since the First Minister has made it clear she's determined to keep Scotland in the EU, both positions surely can't be tenable. Well, shortly before we came on air, Nicola Sturgeon came into the studio and I asked her if she believed that she did have a veto.
Well, I didn't use the word veto, so it's not a word I'm going to use, but I do think Scotland's got a strong position right now. Now, in the talks I had with Theresa May, she said, and she said this afterwards in interviews, that she would listen to options that the Scottish Government brings forward to give effect to how Scotland voted within that wider UK context. Now, after the meeting, she said that she wouldn't trigger Article 50 unless she thought she had a set of circumstances that were acceptable to all parts of the UK.
But she didn't say that to you, is that what you're saying?
Well, it's an extension of what we talked about. So basically how I interpret it is I think we've got a window of opportunity now between where we are right now and the triggering of Article 50, whenever that happens, to see if there is a way of effectively squaring this circle. Is there a way within the UK that Scotland can protect its relationship with the EU in line with how Scotland voted? Now, I'm not going to sit here today and tell you absolutely that I think that is possible. There are significant challenges along the way, but I've also said repeatedly since the referendum that I'm going to examine all options to protect the interests of Scotland that are at stake.
You would be in favour, at a very minimum, of Scotland and indeed the UK staying as part of the single market.
Of course.
Is it your understanding from your conversations with Theresa May that if the Scottish Government says, well, that has to be a bottom line in whatever is being negotiated with Europe, that you could stop her triggering Article 50 until you get that?
I'm going to be pretty honest with you just now. I don't know definitively what the answer to that question is. We're in the rather bizarre situation, I think, where the UK government doesn't even appear yet to know what relationship it is seeking to have with the European Union. So I've heard over the last few days since Theresa May became Prime Minister, different ministers in her government articulate different positions on whether or not the UK should remain within the single market. So I think we're at such an early stage of this process that it's frankly not possible to answer all these questions definitively.
No, I understand but the point is, Theresa May didn't say to you, or did she, look, I will not trigger Article 50 until I've got you on board?
She said she would listen to all options. That's what she said to me. She said afterwards she wouldn't trigger Article 50 until she thought she had a situation that was acceptable to all parts of the UK. Now, you know, what exactly the interpretation of that turns out to be, we will have to wait and see. But we do have a window of opportunity now. The Scottish Government's already started work to look at, in these unprecedented times we're in, whether there are ways of protecting Scotland's relationship within a UK context where the rest of the UK is coming out. Now, will that prove to be possible? I can't say at this stage that it will, but I've got a duty to examine all options.
Okay.
And I've also said, if it proves impossible to protect the interests of Scotland that are, really serious interests at stake, jobs, investment, universities, our rights as citizens, if it proves impossible to protect those within the UK, then of course we have to have the option of considering independence on the table, and that's why I've said it is very much on the table.
I just, before we move on, want to ask you something else about these discussions with Theresa May. She was very strong afterwards in saying that she didn't think there needed to be another independence referendum and that she didn't want Scotland to break away from the rest of the UK. Did she, in your talks, say that the UK government would block you holding another referendum?
No, absolutely.
She didn't say that?
She didn't say she would block a referendum, and interestingly, in the interview I heard afterwards, she didn't say that either. I mean, you've said she was very strong in saying she didn't think there should be another independence referendum and she didn't want Scotland to become independent. I don't think anybody is going to be surprised that that is her position. But we've also heard in recent days the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, the Secretary of State for Scotland, say that they didn't think it would be right if the Scottish Parliament and it's an if at this stage, voted to have another independence referendum. They didn't think it would be right for the UK government to block that.
All right, Theresa May didn't tell you she would use the powers of the UK government to block it, but did she say what Ruth Davidson said. Did she say that they wouldn't do that?
Our discussions were focusing mainly on the process that's about to get underway in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. So that's what we were focusing on. Now, I think I said it on this programme a couple of weeks ago, I will say it again, in the circumstances that Scotland now finds itself in, which is facing exit from the EU against our will, if in these circumstances a Scottish Parliament decided that the only way to protect our interests was to offer the Scottish people the choice of independence, I find it inconceivable that any UK government would stand in the way of that.
I just want to come back to this idea of a veto. You seem a bit unclear on whether you've been handed a veto over the triggering of Article 50 or not.
If you're asking me right now, do I think Theresa May will never, ever trigger Article 50 unless, I'm saying to that I'm absolutely happy with the direction that the UK is taking? I don't know that that is the case, but what she did seem to indicate was that she wanted, as I want, to see if we can find options that respect how Scotland voted, just as I, although I don't agree with it, respect how England and Wales voted. So I'm going to take that window of opportunity to see if we can find these options, because that's in line with what I committed to doing in the morning after the referendum.
What you would want to negotiate. Should it come to December as the kind of time that David Davis has been talking about, when they might trigger Article 50, and you are not satisfied, that you are not on board, and the British government says, well, sorry, we're just doing this anyway, realistically, is there anything you can do?
Well, I would have to consider, as I laid this out in the morning after the referendum. That's why I am also, in parallel to these discussions, making sure that the Scottish Parliament is making preparations to have another independence referendum if we find ourselves in that position.
But so would you take that as a trigger point for a referendum?
I'm not, with the greatest respect, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves just now, but that, of course, at that point, that would be an option and a decision that I would have to consider. Whether we had
in 6 months' time?
Look, whether we had found it impossible to protect Scotland's interests within the UK. Now, I'm going to take this every step of the way. I'm going to play as far as I can with a straight back here and come at this from the perspective of protecting Scotland's interests. Now, that's what I said I'd do in the morning after the referendum, and it's what I'm going to continue to do.
Would you really be happy to have a referendum on independence, say, in the first half of next year?
Look, I will have an independence referendum if I come to a conclusion that I think that is in the interests of Scotland. I've always said that, and I'll continue to say that, because my job is to seek to protect Scottish interests. Now, it would be up to the Scottish people ultimately to decide whether they thought that was the right way to go.
But it's up to you when it would be.
I think that's what I'm saying to you. These are decisions I will have to take, and I will seek to take them as far as I possibly can in line with what I judge to be in the best interests of our economy, of business, of jobs, of our universities, of our freedom to travel, all of these interests that are now seriously, potentially damaged by the Brexit vote.
Were you offered, or do you expect to be offered, as a government, I don't mean you personally, a formal role in the Brexit negotiations?
I expect the Scottish Government to be fully involved in this process, and Theresa May indicated that we would be.
You would actually be negotiating with Europe?
Look, this process, and again, I'm not trying to dodge these questions, but my ability to answer this question kind of rests on the UK government getting its act together. We don't yet know what shape this process is going to take. What Theresa May gave me a commitment to, and I would certainly expect this commitment, is that the Scottish Government will be centrally involved in this process. So Scottish Government officials are already talking to UK Government officials as they begin to shape this process.
But would you expect your officials, again, not you personally,
I would expect us
to be involved in negotiating with Europe alongside David Davis?
I would expect us to be involved in every aspect of this process.
But was any formal offer made to you?
Theresa May doesn't yet know what this process looks like from the UK perspective.
So she couldn't make a formal offer?
Well, the commitment she's given me is that we will be centrally involved. But the extra bit of the commitment, and this is the important bit as far as I'm concerned, is that that's not an involvement in a process that just accepts as inevitable Scotland's exit from the European Union. That is a process in which options that the Scottish Government brings forward will be considered.
Is one of the things that you would want before you got on board in the way that Theresa May indicated, would you want separate Scottish powers over immigration?
Well, immigration is one of these issues where already, even putting the Brexit vote to one side, there is a real tension between what's in the interests of Scotland and what appears to be the direction of the UK government. We've got a case just now, the Brain family, where we've got a family.
Sure, but I'm just trying to get an indication of when Theresa May said she wanted you on board, whether that would be something you would say, well, we want the power to, for example, guarantee residency rights for EU citizens.
I'm not going to get into the specifics of these discussions, not because I'm trying to dodge it, but because we don't yet know what the UK government is going to try to achieve or how this process is going to go forward. But if I can take on the issue of freedom of movement, as part of our relationship with the European Union right now, we're in the single market, we have freedom of movement, which is not just the right of people to come to this country, it's the right of all of us to go and travel and study and work in other European countries. Scotland voted to retain all of these rights, and that's what I've got to seek to achieve.
We talked a minute ago about whether you might trigger a referendum if they trigger Article 50 and you're not happy with it. But in the slightly more medium term, is it your idea that if you are to have another independence referendum, you would, I think you said on this programme a couple of weeks ago, you would like to have it before Britain actually left the European Union?
I think that would be absolutely
But for
sensible.
that to work, you would presumably want some sort of commitment by the European Union that Scotland would either never leave the EU or be fast-tracked back in.
These will all be part of the discussions we have over the next period. But to go back to the first part of your question, and I think I did say this on this programme, of course it would make sense. And I'm using the term "if" here because that is the right word to use. This is speculative at this stage, but if we are in the situation of considering independence again, then of course it would make sense for that to happen before the UK leaves the European Union.
But that affects the timing, because if you don't get that commitment, it doesn't matter when you have a referendum,
well,
does it?
There's all sorts of unknowns and uncertainties. I'm in a position here that I didn't choose to be in. There are all sorts of uncertainties and unknowns that lie ahead of us. My job as First Minister is to seek to navigate Scotland through these uncertainties. Okay. Now, we don't even yet know what the timescale for the UK will be. We heard Philip Hammond, at the time the Foreign Secretary, now the Chancellor, say in the House of Commons last week that he thought it would take 6 years for the UK to exit the European Union. So some of the uncertainty that we're facing just now draws inevitably from the referendum results. Some of it draws from the fact that we've got a UK government that hasn't yet got a grip on where it wants to take things.
This scenario of that there could be an independence referendum, Scotland could somehow either not leave or be fast-tracked back in. Has anyone in the European Union given you any indication that that might be possible?
We are 3 weeks on from a referendum where there is massive uncertainty, and you're expecting me to sit here right now and say that we've got absolute certainty in all of these issues. These are discussions that we will be having.
No, but the reality is that nobody in Europe, when you went there the other week, really gave you any reason to believe that, did they?
When I went to Europe, firstly, I wasn't going asking for that commitment. I was going in the first instance to make sure there was an understanding across Europe of the different positions Scotland was in and that we wanted to seek a different outcome. But I have to say, when I went to Europe, I found a warmth of response and an openness and a sympathy that the Scottish Government, frankly, didn't find in 2014.
No,
I wasn't asking for hard and fast commitments at that point. These are discussions we will have to take forward. Okay. So as we go through this process, I go back to what I said in the morning after the referendum. I'll be open and frank with the people of Scotland about the opportunities and the challenges we face. But I come back to the basic point here. We didn't ask to be in this position, so we have to navigate the best way through it for Scotland, and that's what I remain focused on doing.
Before we finish, another big subject which is coming up, Trident. You are calling for a vote in the House of Commons to be delayed. Why? Is it that you think that there's a realistic prospect that you, together with other people, could stop it?
Well, I would love to think so. The SNP, let me be absolutely clear, I'm not sure this needs saying, but whether it's tomorrow or at any point, the SNP will vote against the renewal of Trident.
So why delay it?
Well, because we're coming out the back, or we're not coming out of it, we are still in a period of huge uncertainty where the principal party of opposition is in chaos, where the party of government has been in chaos for the last few weeks. There hasn't been the opportunity to focus properly on the massive issues that are involved in a decision about Trident. I think
if you get a delay, is it because you think there's a chance that enough MPs will vote against it?
I would hope so, but it would also give people the chance to properly scrutinise this decision, which, given everything else that's happened in the last few weeks, there hasn't been. And I think it's wrong to have this decision as a way of playing games with the chaos in the opposition, which I think is what the Tories are trying to do.
All right, Nicola Sturgeon, we'll have to do that there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.